So as Russ explained, he's given me 10 minutes, so I'm going to do this fast so that we can get through it and really listen to our speakers and listen to you. So as you know, this document, the Instrumentum Laboris, is just a Latin name for a working document. And so this is the document that participants at the Synod in October will use in order to formulate whatever they're going to formulate as they gather. So we know that it was drafted on the basis of all the material that was gathered during the diocesan listening phase, the national listening phase, the continental listening phase. And as we know, this is not business as usual. This has been an unusually wide and comprehensive consultation process that began in 2021 and has continued throughout. So rather than this Instrumentum Laboris, this working document, being sort of or the whole meeting itself being a kind of decision-making meeting, which we normally have had, there are issues that come up, they take a vote, they have a final draft, and then the Pope decides if he's going to affirm that or move away from it. And in this case, the document, the Synod that's going to take place October 4 to 29 will be more like a workshop. And the final product is going to be recommendations and maybe some other things. We're not exactly sure. I don't know that they're exactly sure, but because this is truly a new process. What we do know is that they're saying that this document should be kind of a guide, and that they already expect people to look at this, look at what's, bring with them what they have learned from the final documents of the Continental Assemblies, the report from the Digital Synod. So, and I don't know if you knew there was a Digital Synod, but this was held, they reported on it in February, so it's not entirely clear if it was in December or when it was actually held, or if there was a series of meetings, but they had, basically this was young people. About 10% of them identified themselves as non-believers. They certainly didn't have a relationship with a parish or a community in sort of the traditional Catholic way. And so the Dicastery for Communications set out to have a digital synod, and they said over 2 million people, and they got about 110,000 responses back from it. And there is a report that you can read on that. So they're expecting participants to have read that, to have read the final documents from the Continental Assemblies, to know what's an Episcopalis Communio, which is the document that Pope Francis put out in 2018, which really changed the way synods worked. It went from sort of a rubber stamp operation, as it was under John Paul II and Pope Benedict, to where decisions that are going to be made and were made from that point forward had the possibility of becoming ordinary magisterium, which is a completely different level of authority within the church for a synod. And also, he wants them to know what's in these international commission documents on synodal life and Sensus Fidei, which both documents really support synodality and the voice of laity and, and the spirit coming forth. So given the abundance of the material already available in the Instrumentum Laboris, it's really supposed to be like a practical aid for conducting the Synodal Assembly. So it's a bunch of questions that they're going to decide on, rather than sort of this pre-written text that is usually there. So what's going to happen in Rome in October? So these are approximate numbers. There'll be approximately 370 participants. About 21% will be non-bishops, and we're thinking, over 40 will be women. And Pope Francis, the decision, the final list has not been finalized by Francis. It may be put together, but he hasn't given it its final okay. And it is possible that he could appoint more women. So we're hopeful about that, but it's a big deal. This has moved from a synod of bishops only to a synod and with participants. And, this is the beginning. Hopefully this number of non-bishops will increase as we go along. And the meeting has been moved from the Synod Hall, which if you've ever seen pictures, it's sort of like a auditorium in the round, and with a big screen, and Pope Francis and the panels sit down in front. It's going to be in the Vatican auditorium, which will be much more conducive to what they call small circles of people working. So in the Synod, there are plenaries, which means somebody gets up and talks for a little bit and everybody listens. And then there's these small working groups, which each week will talk about various phases of the Synod. And we know that, and this is approximate because it's really 3.5 weeks, but approximately section A, they're going to talk about what are the fundamentals? What does it mean to be a synodal church? And then in week 2, they're going to talk about this section B, which is communion, mission, participation. What do those things mean? And then there's these series of questions will be posed around those. And then in week 3, they're going to what they call gather the fruits of the Synod. And that so it's not clear what form that's going to take, but it may not look at all like the documents that have come out at the end of synods in previous times. It may look something like it, but what they say they're going to do is gather the fruits and then decide on practical next steps. For instance, if they want to look at, let's just take women deacons, and they say, yes, we see a large agreement across the Synod that there should be women deacons. Maybe there'll be some more study. There'll be some ideas around what would have to change in canon law. And all that will be in preparation for the October 2024 meeting. So as I just said, so the first part, there's like 2 parts, part A and part B. And then part B is this, they'll talk about communion, co-responsibility and mission, and participation, governance, and authority. So the way the document explains it is that mission is central to all this. And we know that from Pope Francis, his idea of evangelization has been central to his mission. So mission is central to synodality, but communion is what makes mission possible. And it really creates our credibility as people who can proclaim a mission. And then out of that mission comes this, in communion comes this practical idea. So, who's going to do what? And how are we going to manage the structure? And so who's going to do, this will be where the questions about, will there be women deacons? Will lay people take on greater roles? What will that look like? And so that's sort of the way it would flow, or it'll flow out of those things. So in this first part, or in this second part, in part B, the title of the section is called Communion That Radiates. And this whole idea is to build up the people of God through shared liturgy, and especially the Eucharist. And it says that, and I love some of this language, it's very hopeful. Communion is an expression of radical unity. So there's a lot throughout this document about diversity, about local church, about the ways that we come together, but in unity. So whether it's different rites or different languages or different cultures, that diversity is supposed to be an expression of radical unity. And so they ask this is one of the questions that comes up in this section. So in order to overcome our fences, our trenches, the way we're divided, which shelters and protections need to be built? I love that. They recognize that people have been, marginalized, excluded, hurt, and they're saying, so how do we build a space, a safe container for people? And then who do we want to protect? Which divisions are unproductive? And to what extent does graduality make communion possible? So, we know the church loves to do that, and Pope Francis is been, I'd say, on that side quite a bit. Most of us want change to happen a lot quicker, but there's this theme about, how do you do this, and how do you do it in a way that we can keep the church together? Whether that's possible or not is another thing. The next part of B is co-responsibility and mission. And they say mission is not a marketing of a religious product, but a construction of a community in which relationships are a manifestation of God's love. Again, beautiful language. And this is an important question. Again, I like these questions. They have a real edge to them. What are members willing to hold in common by virtue of their direct relationship with Christ and with each other? So a missionary synodal church asks how it can recognize and value the contribution of each baptized person. So you'll see throughout this all the time is how do we recognize who we are as individuals, as particular communities, and then how do we stay in communion with each other throughout this? And then the third section in part B is about participation, governance, and authority. And basically what it says is that institutions are not enough to make a synodal church. So you can put all the things in place, but we really need a synodal culture. And in order to get that, we're going to need formation. We're going to need formation all along the way, initial formation, ongoing formation. So we're going to have to really think differently. We're going to move from this church of the 50s where father did everything, sister did everything, the bishop was the decision maker, to a church where we have shared responsibility. And that's a big change for us in the church. Maybe not so much for people who are living in kind of Vatican II parishes already, or in communities that are meant to work that way. But for a lot of people, this is a huge change. And they ask things like, what is the meaning of authority? Is it this worldly authority, this power that we, look at as power over, or is it rooted in service and enabling others to grow, animated through our conversions to more openness? And then in this section, they have a really important part, I think. It's we need renewed language, it says here. And it's in the bottom, and in the end, it means we need language that attracts people. It's not an obstacle to people. We need to be able to talk across different cultures. And we need a change in language in the liturgy, in preaching and catechesis and sacred art, and in basic communication. So we at all times have to think in terms of not only renewal, synodality will mean renewal in all sorts of ways, including the language that we use. So some of the questions that show up, and I'm just posing them to you because these are the questions that participants will be looking at in Rome. So for instance, some of the questions I'll be working on is, how does service of charity and commitment to justice and care for our common home nourish communion in a synodal church? So they're gonna touch on our common home, the environment. How can a synodal church make credible the promise of love and truth that meets? And this is, a big tension in our church. Whose truth, whose, and I think within this document, we can certainly see that the church in some ways still holds on to that notion that they are the holder of the truth, but also working toward this notion that, all of us, the people of God, hold that truth together. So we'll see how that balances out. Another question that they have, how can each local church enhance, promote, and integrate the exchange of gifts with other churches within the horizon of one Catholic Church? And how can local churches be helped to promote the Catholicity of the church in a harmonious relationship between unity and diversity, preserving the specificity of each one? How can we proclaim the gospel effectively in different contexts and cultures in order to foster the encounter with Christ for men and women of our time? And what bonds can we establish with adherents of other religions to build a culture of encounter and dialogue? So that is, I've really just gone over mostly the beginning section of the document and gone into the section on communion a little bit more, just so you can see what kind of questions participants who go in October will be dealing with as they get together and gather around small circles. So back to you, Russ.
Great, thanks for that overview, Deb. One of the, as Deb said at the beginning, one of the real novelties of this working document is that there are all these questions being posed. And it's a very different way, and I think it's a much more synodal way of advancing through a working document. So thanks for that, Deb, and highlighting some of the important questions that we'll be asking as a global community in October. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Kimerly Lymore, Kim Lymore, who is going to offer some perspectives on the document from the perspective of Catholics of color. Of course, we're not expecting Kim to hold every perspective, but her particular insights. Thank you, Kim.
Thank you, Russ and Deb, for the invitation on today. It's always a privilege and a pleasure to be with everyone, you and Deb, and also for the FutureChurch viewership and participants. It's always a great showing and interest in everything that is taking place within the church, and it's just a wonderful feeling, even though most of us are a little on the gray side. And so one of these days, though, hopefully we will get the younger folks involved, so that, because they're really the future of the church. So some of these things might not take place in our lifetime, but in somebody's lifetime. Anyway, after reading at least part of the document I could get through on today, one of the things that struck me was about the whole bringing together communion, mission, and participation. I think a lot of times, not only in churches of color, but in the Catholic Church in general, communion is almost like an isolated event. It is not part of what happens, like we come to communion and that it's something we should change because we take communion, and that taking the communion should take us out into the mission and into being able to participate in the whole life of the church. People of color have, of course, have been marginalized, have been and even women. I mean, if you want to even include the women in this too, marginalized, not able to sometimes fully participate. I always love, I don't know, and most of you probably have know this, the Thea Bowman quote when she went to see and talk to the USCCB bishops. And she said that, what does it mean to be Black and Catholic? It means that I come to the church fully functioning. That doesn't frighten you, does it? I come to my church fully functioning. I bring myself, my Black self, all that I am, all that I have, and all that I hope to become. And unfortunately, it's been a struggle, still a struggle, even in 2023, to bring those words to life. People of color, especially African Americans, are still striving to be accepted in this church. And so it's a struggle, even when we think about this whole synodal process that's been going on since 2021. It kind of started, pandemic was still around. And I don't think that a lot of people in our pews, in our Black Catholic mixed multicultural churches, even have a clue of what the synodal process is. We come and, because I participate, I'm at CTU. I am, like I say, part of the Black Catholic Theological Symposium, the convener. And, a few weeks ago, we had a session on that working document for the continental stage. And it's just like, who's at this table? Who's writing these documents? Are there people like us there to voice their opinion? And a lot of the wording tends to be more generalized and not really specific. But being a people of hope, we are always hopeful that these sessions, it's one thing that it's doing is bringing a lot of different people from when we think about the audience on today, from across the world stage, bringing us together just to have a conversation a conversation that we might not necessarily have had the opportunity to have with other folks. And I think it's wonderful that this whole synodal process is doing that, is bringing a different array of people together, being able to truly dialogue. And if they have questions, answer that, go back, pray, discern, mull over it, and just be able to see how they can see themselves in this. So as Black Catholics, like you say, we are steady looking at that, and how do we fit in the world stage of the church? Who's at the table, voicing our opinions? We know now we've got a woman that was on this synodal process that was picked by the Pope or whatever back in the day, back when it kind of got started. But who is really at the table speaking for us, voicing our concerns? And we also know that documents, we have so many wonderful documents, and the language in these are very beautiful. But when it comes to the grassroots really knowing about this, how does this change our paradigm? How does this change the way we think? How does this change the way we have relationship with each other? And in the church, we always say that the most segregated hour on a Sunday morning is the 11 o'clock hour in the church, where everyone is in really their own little silos. You have folks in their white Catholic churches, you got the Hispanic in the Hispanic, got the Black Catholics, and just and some of them might be intercultural, multicultural parishes, but for the most part, very segregated times. And so we don't necessarily are able to truly interact and get to know folks. I mean, I think that's the whole thing about this. If we get to know each other, then that could kind of erase the hatred and the sense of fear that may be out there to keep us from truly harming each other, but being able to be brothers and sisters in Christ, because we do have we have the same goal. We serve in the same God. We are working toward the same mission, to be able to bring the good news to the world. However we do it, it might be different. It looks different from over here, what we do over here at St. Sabina in Chicago, than what people do in their parishes. And so how will this synodal process change the people, and change people in that their heart changes, that they can read this or encounter others, or however we try to walk this process out and make it flesh and manifest it. I think too, when I wrote down, as Deb, you were talking, that this is really probably more, the bishops are in charge, of course, and everything, but this is more of a grassroots, I think, movement. And when we think about the civil rights movement and all of that, it was always grassroots, ground up, boots on the ground, people that are in the pews that are doing that. The other word that came out, not only in this one, but in that working document, was co-responsibility. How do we, come together as lay and clerical? There's always been a lot of division among that, and especially lay women and clerical, even laymen. But it's just a continuing to try to work that out, so that we are all working together in this mission for Christ, so that we know that we're doing the best that we can, and that this has been offered, and it's a wonderful thing. I had highlighted a couple of things I just want to highlight before my time is up. I said I wasn't going to talk 10 minutes, but it looks like I'm going. But when it talked about a communion that radiates in that B.1.1 section, it said a synodal church can offer a prophetic witness to a fragmented and polarized world. And we know that our world, and especially here in the United States, our politics and our religion is very polarized, especially when its members are committed to walking together with others for the building of the common good in places marked by deep conflict this requires the ability to be agents of reconciliation and artisans of peace. That's it's wonderful language. And the fact that they want the synodal process to be prophetic, because a lot of times, we're just kind of looking in our own here, there, with the blinders on. And we need to kind of start to look toward the future. What does it look the future for our young people coming into church? What's the future like? How do we, bring people together? Why don't they want to come to our church? Ask, begin to talk and ask the hard questions to be able to be more prophetic in that, in the mission that we're doing in the church. I mean, it's rubrics and the religion and all of that is okay. And we get used to the ritual, but how are we really dealing with racism? How are we dealing with the violence in our communities? And it's not only Black communities, it's across the stage. We can't go to malls and movie theaters and without, parades, without being afraid and having this fear of the violence that might take place. I think I'll stop there. If there's, at the end, if there's any questions, I mean, it's a good document. It offers hope. We're people of hope. And so we always work toward the best.
Great. Thank you so much, Kim. I love that that quote from Sister Thea, and I've never thought of it in terms of synodality before, but I think you're absolutely right. We would do well to hold on to that, especially as we seek to be a synodal church that is welcoming the perspectives of others, and to take that question. That doesn't scare you, does it?
Right.
Yeah. So, all right. Thank you, Kim. And with that, I'd like to turn things over to Marianne Duddy-Burke, who is Executive Director of DignityUSA.
Thank you, Russ and Deb, and all of you for the opportunity to share some thoughts and to really kind of probe with you what this instrumentum document means for all of us and for the wider church. It's great to engage with so many folks around this. I feel like I need to kind of take a breath after all of the great wisdom that Deb and Kim have already shared, and certainly look forward to what Frank's going to say. So I think, like many other people, I really found sort of the format, the questions format, the call to come ready to listen deeply and to engage with each other for folks who are going to be in the room, and the themes that were pulled out to be sort of the most startling and most welcome part of this instrumentum. I think that pretty much echoes what Deb was saying. The focus on communion and mission felt very, very powerful and very hopeful. And as I read through the document, it took me back to a moment in Dignity's history. It was in the summer of 1995, and DignityUSA was facing what essentially could have been a very existential crisis for us. I happened to be the president at that point, and it was my task to manage the House of Delegates, which was, all of our communities send a proportional representation to this governing event. Essentially, it's a kind of a unicameral legislature that met every couple of years and passed the major policies that governed our organization. In this particular year, we were facing a hugely controversial subject. By that point in our history, almost every diocese where Dignity had a chapter had banned priests that had faculties from presiding at Dignity liturgy. And our community was in a huge crisis over how we could continue to have access to the Eucharist and to the sacraments. And, folks were really struggling to fill that void that they felt, by not having the kind of access that we were used to. So a proposal floated that Dignity would start ordaining its own priests. And, for some folks, it was a way of really modeling the church that we felt we could help to create. And for others, it was talked about as this is going to put us in schism with the larger church. So, there were these diametrically opposing motions that were coming forward, and it was just very tense all across the country, lots of conversations with national leadership, and it was a very scary time. I mean, I really felt like I might be presiding over the implosion of our entire organization. So our board met the day before the House was to convene, and we just decided to upend everything and do it very differently. So in the House, all the delegates got together. We did the basics of what we had to do to, legally call the House to order. And then we asked the delegates to suspend all of the parliamentary rules that we operated under. And, when we explained why, they agreed and they were willing to take a chance with us. So we sent the group, we broke the room up into groups of, maybe 25 people, trying to mix folks from different parts of the country, different chapters, different experiences. And we sent them off into rooms. And their task was simply to listen to each other without interrupting. And at the end of each speaker's turn, they were to sit in silent prayer for a minute before the next speaker spoke. And we asked them questions like, what was each community facing locally? How had they come to their beliefs about what was the best way to move forward? A number of questions like that. As you can imagine, it took a very long time. And this went on for hours and hours late into the evening. And then finally, the working groups came back together and sort of reflected on what they heard. As a result of all of those conversations, all of the sort of competing motions about how we have liturgies were drawn off the table, and a small group of about 6 or 8 people was appointed to come up with a new motion, which they were to present the following day. And what they came back with was a motion that acknowledged that Dignity was a community of Catholic communities, that each functioned in a very unique locale, an environment, and mix of people, and they had varied needs and resources. It asked us to put the responsibility for determining local governance and local liturgical practices with the local leaders who are closest to the needs of the people, and mandated that no national policy would ever be set to determine the requirements for leadership of prayer and worship. It was clear that worship leaders from then on could be lay or ordained. They could represent any gender, any ministerial status, any identity. They could be in relationships or not, just anyone whom the community felt was called to help guide their worship and their community forward would be asked to do so by the local community. And it also acknowledged that DignityUSA and our chapters didn't have the infrastructure to ordain people in any way, so that the call of the local community was the only authority needed to take on the role. I may be wrong, but I think that the motion passed unanimously. And what was, a crisis for us became a huge opportunity and a turning point that has governed how we have prayed together and formed community for the last 28 years and doesn't look like it's going to change. The only thing that has changed is several years after this was passed, the national board did mandate that no person who had been credibly accused of sexual abuse of a minor could take on a liturgical leadership role. We felt that was really important to do. So I share this story as an indication of how the kind of process that the instrumentum calls for can truly be a way of achieving something miraculous through deep listening and welcoming the Spirit's inspiration. But I also want to note that we in Dignity had certain advantages that the Synod will not, right? We all worked in a single national context. So even though there's state by state variation, most of us speak the same language and understand, US church stuff. We also have long had accountability built into our structures. So there was a very high level of trust in our organization's national leadership. There were not the sort of pro-Francis and anti-Francis camps. And there had been years and years of close bonds built up among many of these delegates through years of regional and national work that many of them had engaged to. So in terms of the process, I think there's a lot that is both really exciting and hopeful and also cautionary in what this instrumentum lays out for us. When it comes to the specific questions about how LGBTQ plus people are addressed in the planning document, what I see, first of all, is a huge acknowledgement that the changing social visibility and expectations of appropriate pastoral care and the explicit expectations of equality and inclusion in our church, as well as in social spaces, has become an issue that the institutional church can no longer hide from. We really need to tackle this on together, mindful of the various social contexts that our church operates in. It was also clear to me that it seems that the expectation that creating a more welcoming church for LGBTQ plus and other marginalized people should be an outcome of the Synod. Personally, I found the consistent use of LGBTQ plus, a way of naming us that is acceptable and embraced by our community, by most of our community, is really notable and something that we can't just take for granted. On the flip side, I sort of worry that creating a welcoming church is sort of a tragically low bar for the goals of the Synod. And I am unclear if there will be any space to address, dogmatic condemnation, exclusion from sacraments, refusal of healthcare, Catholic leadership in anti-LGBTQ plus civil rights policy, assurances that our gifts and our service will be welcomed and protected. As with women, there's a lot that is left unsaid. So I question, is the table really being set for all, or will some continue to just get scraps? The other question that I had, and Deb highlighted this language in one of the slides, is that need to balance love and truth. For LGBTQ people, at least here in the US, speaking the truth in love has been a platitude often used by church officials who prioritize doctrine that dehumanizes our community. And I'm concerned that this language might have been included as sort of a coded reassurance to some bishops and other Synod participants that change in doctrine is not really on the table. I really hope I'm wrong, but it is a fear. And as Kim said, my third thought was really that much of what's going to happen is going to depend on who's in the room and what the dynamics of the Synod turn out to be. And we just don't know that, as Deb said. As the story I told at the opening demonstrated, openness, deep listening, trust, willingness to create something new, and a deep commitment to the good of the people of God can lead to remarkable things. And there are so many people across the world who need gospel-based ministry. And I hope and pray that that's the call that everybody involved in the Synod hears, and that they respond to the urgency of the needs of God's people.
Thank you, Marianne, and especially for sharing that story. I've known you for a long time, and I've never heard that story. And it's a reminder to me that for so many of us, this word synodality is new. And in many ways, the process of synodality for our church and the way it's being carried out now is new. But there are communities out there who have lived it and from whom the church can learn an awful lot, Dignity being one of them. And certainly, I think lots of congregations of women religious as well have been walking this walk. Thank you, Marianne, for your perspective. And with that, we'll turn things over to Frank DeBernardo, Executive Director of New Ways Ministry.
Thank you, Russ, and thanks to everyone at FutureChurch, Deb, and all the staff, and thanks to all the participants who are here on this call. I saw a lot of friends' names of people I've met over the years, so it's really a delight to be here. I'm glad to have the opportunity to reflect more deeply on the Instrumentum Laboris than I had done in the past week, and especially to look at this area of communion. I think the good news of this document is that LGBTQ plus topics are on the agenda. The large number of times that these were mentioned in Synod reports around the world showed that it could not be avoided, and that the two mentions that it does get in the working document confirms that it is going to be discussed in October. But I've adjusted my expectations since the Synod process began in October 2021. I no longer expect, as I had originally hoped, that we're going to see great change in terms of church teaching on LGBTQ plus issues. But I do think that the Synod is going to be a good step in a direction that can lead to change. It's curious to me that LGBTQ plus issues appeared in the section on communion, because potentially it could have also appeared in the areas of mission or participation and authority. But the area of communion in the document seems to be focused on areas where people have disagreements or do not share common goals. For example, it's the area where the topics of ecumenical dialogue is covered, as well as how the church can be in dialogue with secular culture, which does not always share identical values. This says to me that the organizers of the Synod noticed that there is a lot of strong and varied opinions on LGBTQ issues, something I think we already know here in the States. It also says to me that perhaps one of the results of the Synod, it's not going to be major changes on LGBTQ issues, but it's going to be sort of how to continue having a conversation about the topic. Now, I don't think that's a consolation prize. I do think it's a step in the right direction. I saw that because of, I think that because of one of the statements from the document says that the term conversation, and this is a quote, the term conversation does not indicate a generic exchange of ideas, but a dynamic in which the words spoken and heard generates familiarity, enabling the participants to draw closer to one another. And that's the end of the quote. I think that if people who argue from both sides about LGBTQ issues in the church can achieve that familiarity and drawing closer to one another, I think that will be a major miracle. And I think other miracles can come from that. Empirical research and anecdotal evidence all points to the fact that people change their attitudes about LGBTQ people when they hear their stories, when they finally do enter conversation. This section on communion looks forward optimistically based on the idea that already the discussions in the earlier phases of the Synod process have produced good things. And this is another quote. It said that these encounters, meaning the earlier discussions, did not lead to paralysis, but nourished the hope that the Synod will be a catalyst for this renewal of mission and will prompt us to mend the relational fabric of the church. To mend the relational fabric of the church. In terms of LGBTQ issues, there is definitely a great need for that. Another statement in the document says this: how can we create spaces where those who feel hurt by the church and unwelcomed by the community feel recognized, received, free to ask questions, and not judged? What concrete steps are needed to welcome those who feel excluded from the church because of their status or sexuality? And then it mentions a variety of categories, including LGBTQ. And again, create spaces, feel recognized, received, free to ask questions, not be judged. I think these are really very important messages that, if they are truly lived out, will help to change a lot in the church for LGBTQ people. And then finally, there's another question. How can we restore proximity and caring relationships as the core of the church's mission, walking with people instead of talking about them or solely at them? And when I read that, I said, wow, I don't think any phrase better describes the recent history of many church leaders' language toward LGBTQ people than the phrase talking about people or solely at them. And so if we can, if the Synod could help to restore caring relationships instead of those attitudes, I think that will be really great. The power with which this document talks about the marginalized, I think, challenges the church to listen and respond. I think the strong language that they used about marginalized people, it's going to be very hard to ignore them. And, you know, for instance, here's two questions that they wrote. What have we learned about how to support the belonging and participation of the most marginalized? What needs to happen to enable their greater involvement in our walking together? And how do we let their voices question our way of doing things when it is insufficiently inclusive of them? Especially that last part, the church is asking, you know, they're asking the church to be challenged by the marginalized, not just to tolerate, welcome, accept them, but to be challenged by them. The best thing about this section on communion that bodes well for LGBTQ people is that it focuses on diversity. It recognizes that diversity exists in the church, not just diversity in terms of ethnicities and race, but wide diversity, and particularly diversity in terms of the differences of opinion that about matters which are extremely important to people's lives. This section on communion, I think, promises to help forge a way out of impasses, censorship, and the hurling of anathemas that has gone on for way too long in the church. The document says this about a synodal church. A synodal church is called to practice the culture of encounter and dialogue with the believers of other religions, with cultures and societies in which it is embedded, but above all, among the many differences that run through the church itself. The church is not afraid of variety it bears, but values it without forcing it into uniformity. I think that if the Synod leaders can agree on affirming and expanding those statements, I think that we're going to be ideally situated to see an opportunity for future change in the church on LGBTQ issues. So that's why I think it's the best that we can hope for, is to get a roadmap. For some people, such an outcome is not enough, but I know that after so many decades of silence and censorship around LGBTQ issues, that preparing for opportunities for real, honest, faith-filled, personal, and theological discussions to happen, I think can be extremely transformative. So I for one, am very excited about the possibilities this meeting will have for opening up a discussion. And I just want to close with what I thought was absolutely probably the most beautiful sentence I've ever read in a church document. In the middle of a whole discussion, it said, whenever we encounter another person in love, we learn something new about God. So thanks for your attention.
Thank you so much, Frank, for your input. One of the threads that I'm noticing through everything that you and Kim and Marianne and Deb had said, so much is going to matter on who is present and who is in that room. Are they able to encounter each other in that love that that will allow them to learn something new about God? It's part of why FutureChurch joined with Dignity and I believe New Ways and other organizations in Catholic Organizations for Renewal to call on our bishops to make sure that there was broad representation from the communities that we all represent at the Synod, that they would commit to putting forward those kinds of people. So at this time, I'm going to go ahead and open up the chat so that folks who might want to respond in the chat can do so. But I'm also going to make space for, let's see, we've got about 15 minutes or so, 17 minutes or so for questions and some conversations. So if you would like to ask a question, you can use the little reaction button that's at the bottom of your screen. It looks like a little smiley face with a plus. And then you'll have the raise hand button at the bottom of the pop-up window. So if you've got a question, do raise your hand. And in the meantime, I'm going to get all of our panelists on the screen. All right, so I see that Joanna, you have a question or a comment. So let me give you the ability to unmute yourself and go ahead.
Thank you, Russ. Thank you. My question is, with the October Rome Synod meeting, are there articulated any clear outcomes and action plans for how these outcomes will affect what happens in the local parish? Like, are there clear guidelines in that regard, or is it all just going to be more discussion? Like, I know we had in the 90s in Sydney, we had the bishop's survey on the role of women in the church, but nothing came of it, like it was all discussion and then it was summarized, but there was no action after it. Are there any clear action plans after the Synod in October? Thanks.
Let me just take a quick stab at it. So I think the document is trying to help us manage our expectations about what's going to come out of this. There's this October 23 is actually going to lead into October 24, where I do think we'll see more solid decisions. They are specifically saying they're going to gather honestly, they're doing this also by the seat of their pants. They've never done a synod like this before. So they have really smart people. I think, Sister Natalie Bacart and, other people are very thoughtful about this process, but it is completely new. And so what they're saying is that after they have these discussions, ask these questions of each other, they're going to gather the fruits, which if you've been in any meeting, what does that mean? Well, they're going to try to put together some sort of sense of what was said, what was important, what the priorities were. And then they're going to do some practical things, like it's like they may, say, well, we need to study this in some way, shape, or form between now and next year. We need to look at canon law, what would have to change in order for this to come forward. So I agree with, what was said before by Frank and Marianne and Kim. I think we're going to see, more, really a map, more like, here's what we've heard. Here's what we got to talk about some more. Here's what we got to think about in practical terms. And then we're going to go into 24. So no, I don't think, except for this notion of synodality, which I think is being encouraged at that local level, like this way of deciding and being together is something that should be happening from the grassroots up. Now, as Kim said, a lot of Catholics don't know anything about this. And so that's a problem, and a formation problem, and and so forth. But I would not expect there to be a plan that will go to the local parishes after this synod. I would expect that it's going to be moving on to 24.
Thanks, Joanna, for the question. Deb, thank you for the answer. Did anyone else want to weigh in? I have nothing to add. I thought that was really good, Deb. All right. Let's see. We've got Ed. You've got your hand up. Let me get you on the screen here and go ahead and ask your question. Oh, you'll have to unmute, Ed. There you go.
There we are. Okay, I wanted to thank Marianne for sharing the story of Dignity's struggle. I think it is so inspirational. And I think I picked up from the context of her whole story that Dignity communities did empower themselves to choose and raise up leaders, call them priests or ministers, whatever. But I hope they're doing that. I belong to an inclusive community affiliated with the Association of Roman Catholic Priests, and we are doing that. We have probably 10 priests, 2 men, one of whom is gay, 8 women, 2 of whom are married to one another. And I think the church, we cannot wait for canon law to be changed. We should begin to be the church we are called to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Ed. I just respond. I think there are so many forms of Catholicism that this process of talking with one another as part of the synod has led us all to discover. And hopefully that, that informs the dreaming and the visioning that can happen. And I think, for many of us going through this process of developing that church that we know can exist, makes us more committed to the truths and the core values of our church. So it's really amazing work to be able to be part of.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ed. All right. Let's see. We've got Daryl. Let me get you on the screen here, Daryl.
Okay, this will be quick. We all here, I think, have the affliction of being faithful Catholics, despite open minds and open hearts, and stayed faithful to a church that tends to drive you crazy often. But I'll just be curious, and people have answered it a little bit already, but I just would be curious, what is your level of optimism, not about radical change, but about what may happen from this process over the next 2 years?
Would anyone like to take that first?
Well, let me just say quickly, Daryl, there have been a lot of changes. If you look, they're still too small, But I think back, I don't know what year that was, Frank, when there was a huge argument at the Synod about whether you could use, the language was homosexual, and the LGBT community was saying, no, this is our name. And it didn't get into the document. So, I mean, I think what we're going to see is the changes are going to be like, I think maybe Frank described them very well. It's more like we're going to meet each other, and that's going to open things up. But I do think that after this October meeting, there will be some real groundwork done on what is teaching supposed to look like. I mean, where do we have to amend, change? Where does canon law get? And I only say these things is because people like Ruffini, Luciano has been intimately involved in shaping this process, and Natalie Picard has been intimately involved. And what they both understand is you cannot have a truly synodal church where power, authority is shared between laity and ordained and, people in all kinds of cultures and communities, unless you have changes in canon law that support it. So as much as the document will say, well, we can change institutions all we want, but we have to change the culture. It's a heuristic circle. You have to change, institutional pieces. You have to change a structure in order to change the culture. So it's both, and it's not one or the other. The church would like to say, well, we've got to get this culture down first before. That's not true. They have to make changes structurally for synodality to survive and to continue to carry on. We can all be as enthusiastic as we want to, which most of us in the progressive communities have been for a long time. But for the church, where a lot of Catholics live, and a lot of Catholics are still in, still living like I said, that 50s mode of church, it will make a difference for them. And it'll really bring the church into a new maturity. But we do have to see changes. And I do think we will see some changes. I really do. Otherwise, this is, an exercise in niceness and talk. So.
Thanks, Deb. Yes, I will add that we are going to have a session. Our third session is going to be on the authority and governance and what structures might need to change, what institutions might need to change, what canon law might need to be changed. We will be addressing that in our third session. So some of that very real sort of concrete systemic change that I think people are looking for, we will have a dedicated session to that. So thanks, Daryl, for the question. Let's see, we've probably got time for these last two questions. So I'm going to go to Mary Moore first, and then Rita, you're on deck. So Mary, let me get you on screen here.
Hi, everyone. So, Deb, I think you kind of addressed this. I'm in a very progressive parish. In fact, Sister Natalie came and spoke at our parish, and it was in conjunction with our university. So it was co-sponsored by a religious community and a Jesuit community. Her whole process for that evening was to address young adults and other marginalized and women. It was young adults and women. It was very enlightening and it was wonderful, and she's going to be a great representative all through this synodal process. But the problem is getting this out, getting all the materials, getting out all the things to the general public. And most people in my parish, as progressive as we are, as accepting as we are, we have a great outreach to the gay, lesbian community and to the young adults especially. We even have a mass that's dedicated to them. And so that was a Tuesday before Holy Week. And Good Friday, I had the privilege to read the first reading, which is my favorite in the whole Bible. And there was a Hispanic woman who read in Spanish. Outside of us, the testosterone was bouncing off the altar rail. You know, it was just bouncing off the step. I mean, everybody who brought up the cross was male. All the Eucharistic ministers were male, dressed in black. They looked like funeral directors. And I'm sitting there going, this was less than a week ago that Sister Natalie came and talked to us. But most of us, I guess, that were at that meeting, I mean, there were university people, but I think a lot of us were like, I'm so grateful to Future Church, because as progressive as my church was, nobody held special meetings. The Archdiocese held one meeting on a Saturday, and it was on the other side of town. I didn't even go to it. It's so frustrating. You know, we're sort of talking to each other, and we're talking to the choir. How do we help other people to know about this thing and how invaluable I hope it will be? Who was asking about how we feel? I'm sort of skeptical because, you know, especially women or other minority groups, we're sort of led along and then they pull the rope back on us. So I'm sorry to have taken so much time, but I'm excited about Future Church. But how do we get the word out? And people want to know. I gave your website to 2 other women that I know who are desperate to get involved. And there are other people out there, but you may not have an answer. But anyhow, thank you.
I think we certainly understand sort of this tension. There's some hope here, but there's also like there's the pain and the hurt and the frustration that we carry. And you know, I'm relatively new to this, but some folks have been, you know, haven't been working in church reform for 10 years or so now. Some folks have been at it for, I mean, decades, and I marvel at their persistence. And I guess the thing that I take away from them is that over these last 50 plus years, it's been bit by bit, piece by piece, and just sticking to it that has brought us to even this place. And I know that this place is not necessarily an exciting, sudden reactionary time, like you would expect a chemical reaction or something, but it's a slow gurgling or bubbling or something. But it was just that 50 years of stick-to-itiveness. And one of the things that, oh gosh, now I'm going to forget his name, author of the book on racism in the church, Father Massengale
Yeah.
said is when he gave a presentation to future churches that this work is a relay race, and we take our baton and we run with it, and we run so that the next person can run, and the next person runs so that the next person can run. And I just take a lot of hope in knowing that I'm doing my part here and now so that whoever takes it up in the future can run. Because if I don't run my part, then the baton never gets to the next person. Again, that's more beautiful language, but and not necessarily something substantive, but I know just playing my part gives me some sense of hope. And I can't necessarily control others. And I certainly understand why others would not want to be involved. They've been hurt too many times by the church. I get that. So I guess I do what I can to play my part. I don't know if that's helpful at all, Mary.
Well, I guess my basic question, I sort of went off on an emotional tangent, but I guess my question is, even within our congregation, there are people who want to learn more about the Synod. And like, thank God for Future Church that we were able to fill out the forms through you, because as again, I'm in an incredibly progressive parish. nobody was offered to get the forms to fill them out. There are so many people that are hungry for information on this. And if anyone has an idea of how we can get it more into the pews, you know, if the clergy won't do it, and forget my archbishop, if they won't do it, then how do we take that baton you talked about?
Well, shoulder tap those folks in your pews. That's how it's grassroots. You know, hey, do you want to come together and talk about this? Do you want to, you know, meet for coffee and talk about this? Get a small group and spread the word. And I mean, that's sort of the foundation of grassroots organizing is reach out to the people you know who would first be receptive to this kind of thing, and then just grow that circle, grow that circle, grow that circle. And even if your parish doesn't do it, you're creating church. You're doing church by creating that space for people. And there's nothing stopping you from getting together with fellow parishioners for dinner or coffee or anything like that, you know? So that would be my suggestion, is just go back to the basics, just shoulder tap and foster a community if your parish isn't going to do it. And maybe your parish will catch on if they're a progressive parish that something good's happening and they should get involved. I did promise Rita that we would ask her, we'd give her a chance to ask her questions. So I'm going to turn things over to Rita real quick. And if you could make it quick, I'm sorry, Rita.
No, that's okay. Oh, that's okay. Thank you. No problem. One of the things I wanted to point out is my parish did do the synod, both the Vatican way, and submitted all our materials. And it takes a lot of work. And most of the people are, you know, still working. So I'm trying to look ahead to how my parish can be a synodal parish, even if the synod is a bust. You know, we got to know each other better, learn, you know, we're probably 60% Spanish speaking, 40% other Anglo, but other minorities. And it was just really beneficial. We did a synodal listening sessions with our confirmation students, and they got into it immediately. And I'm meeting tomorrow night, as a matter of fact, with the director of religious ed and our confirmation, my confirmation buddy teacher. And we're going to be discussing how do we put synodality into the formation for confirmation students, even if it's only in our parish, but they have that experience. So this is connected to someone else put a question in the chat, which I think Russ and Deb, we could probably pick up on in FutureChurch, is are there best practices? And I would even get, and I think either Dignity or New Ways Ministry said that you have best practices on your website. Maybe we can even drill down and get best practices for sort of making a parish council into a synodal operating institution. And then also, how do we bring this into this education for our students and for ourselves as parishioners? But again, the other thing is this takes work. And I almost think we need to warn people, like, you have to plan a little staffing on this. So those are my observations, and thanks for a great session.
The other thing I want to say is, I mean, for Mary, you know, think about what happened at Vatican II. I mean, structures changed. So we do need to see canon law change. We need parish councils who have deliberative voices. We need canonical changes that actually follow in terms of the idea of, if we're going to make decisions together, if we're going to discern together, we actually have to structures that really give us all deliberative voices, those people that are part of our local community. So I think you won't see it again, you won't see it necessarily this year at the end of this, but I do think that as they recognize structural changes need to occur, we will see the actual formation of those structures such that real changes can take place at the local level, so that people like you will have a deliberative voice in your parish and say, if you're on a council and saying, Father, whatever your priest's name is, we have to do this. And then, so there's more of a chance for real discernment together and real deliberation together.
Great, thanks, Deb, and thank you, Rita, for your observations. And thank everyone for what was going on in the chat. We're going to preserve that and try to get to some of it in future sessions, and do take some of your good thoughts and questions from that. I want to thank Kim, and Marianne and Frank so much for your time, for your insights, and for your wisdom. We're graced by your presence. Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us. Again, next week, we're going to talk about co-responsibility and mission. We're going to be especially addressing some of the questions that folks have about the role of the laity and the role of women and women's ordination and things like that in that session. And then that third session, we're going to talk about structural changes as well for the week after that. So thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you have a beautiful night and a wonderful rest of the week.